hope you understand how Macon's Bill number 2 was set up, and the idea is to try to sort of, it's sort of like we're going to try to bribe them if they will repeal their measures. What we want them to do is to repeal their measures and accept that the United States is a neutral, and as such, we have the right to trade with everybody as much as we want. So that's what we're trying to do. Well, in early 1812, Napoleon tricked us. Napoleon had a diplomat meet with some American diplomat. They met somewhere in Europe at some sort of a secret rendezvous. And the French diplomat showed the Americans some documents that supposedly were Napoleon's repeal of the Berlin and Milan decrees. But they were fake. They were forged documents. They were not genuine items. But we thought they were. We got sucked in by Napoleon's deceit, and we reimposed the embargo against England. And we waited for England to repeal its measures. And they did not. They refused. And through this whole time, there's been a lot of other negotiating going beyond. We've met with the British ambassador to the United States. We've talked to him on many occasions. Our ambassador to London has met with the English government on many occasions. There's been a lot of stuff going on and a lot of efforts to solve this, and none of it's worked. So, in June of 1812, President Madison went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war. He's asked to go to war against England. And he gave us his reasons. He sent a very long document. It's a written document, and it was read to Congress. The president did appear to Congress personally. And in this document, he spelled out why we should go to war against England. And there are a number of reasons, but there's two of them that really stood out, the two main reasons, one of which I've been talking about. It's that England refuses to recognize American neutrality. They will not accept us as a neutral nation. They will not accept the fact that as a neutral, we have a right to trade with everybody. So that's first. A second reason is somewhat related. It also involves shipping and trade and so forth. I haven't talked about that. But another issue that's been coming up all this time that this war has been going on, which has now been, 12 or 7 years or whatever it is, 8 years? The English Navy has been utilizing a policy that they have actually used for hundreds of years. It's called impressment. Impressment, that's a little bit of an odd term. What it amounts to is it's sort of like a draft. The English Navy always had trouble getting people to serve in the Navy. They had trouble convincing people to enlist in the Royal Navy. It was for understandable reasons. I mean, I think if I were an English young man in those days, I would not ever want to sign up to be in the Navy. The conditions aboard the ships in peacetime were really harsh. The captains of a ship were absolute gods on their ship. Their rule was absolute. You could not question anything. You could not criticize them in any way. You had no voice, and there were no restrictions on the powers of an English Navy captain. He could punish you in any way that he wanted, to any extent. If the punishment got so extreme that you died, if he whipped you so badly that you just died, too bad. There's no recriminations against him. He's absolutely master. He has the right to do it. Nobody can challenge that. There's no enforcement against him. There's no violation of any rules that he may have made. There's no protection for crewmen, and you're just at the mercy of the captains. And some of them may have been good men, but some of them were just absolute psychopaths. and they just would punish the crews as hard as they could, and then just do whatever they wanted. So it was tough to be there. It's also tough to go to sea. There's storms, even under the natural conditions, ships sink. They still do. I mean, even with all of our modern technology and radar and GPS and whatever else, fishing boats still sink. A passenger liner in Italy turned over and people were killed a few years ago. I mean, life at sea is a dangerous life. And some ships went out to sea, some of the English Navy ships, they sailed off and they never came back. And we have no idea what happened to them. They just disappeared. So, it's tough to be in the English Navy. And so far I've just been talking about under peacetime. In wartime, it gets a lot worse. Because now you're out there and there's people shooting at you and trying to kill you. And the naval combat in this time was just extremely bloody. The English Navy painted their ships, the decks of their ships, red as sort of a kind of a psychological trick, that when they'd be in combat, that there'd be so much blood running all over the decks everywhere. And the idea was that you paint the deck red, then maybe it won't show so badly as to how much blood is actually being spread around there. Once a ship went into action, there were young men aboard the ship, even teenagers or a little bit younger, midshipmen, whose job it was to run around with buckets of sand and throw the sand on various places on the deck where there was blood and guts all over, so that people wouldn't slip and slide on the blood and gore of the battle. I mean, it was just awful. It was just awful. So the only way the English Navy could get people to serve was by what was called pressing them into the Navy, forcing them into the Navy, or impressment. English Navy officers, usually accompanied by a couple of enlisted men, could go around anywhere in England, anytime, anyway, and if they saw somebody that they felt would make a good crew member, they could just go up to him and say, "You're in the Navy now. You've been pressed. This is the official thing. You have to come with us and go off and serve. Whether you get able to come back or not, who knows? Probably not." English villages during the wartime would have somebody posted to watch any roads coming into the village 24 hours a day. And if any crew, if it looked like there was some men coming towards the town that could possibly be what was called a press gang, then maybe an officer and half a dozen other men, and if they were coming to town and it looked like they're marching and so forth, and they might be a press gang, then the person who was watching was supposed to run around and tell everybody, "Hey, there's a press gang coming, there's a press gang coming," so that all the young men in town could go and hide and escape impressment. Because impressment was a death sentence. So England's been doing that. And yes, they could, and they did, go out into the countryside and press young farm boys, but they preferred to get established sailors. They preferred to get people who knew how to tie knots and climb rails or whatever, and spread a sail and do the other stuff that you had to know how to do to sail a ship. Well, the people who did that were the crew members of merchant ships, civilians who are working as civilians, as a sailor on a ship, just a regular merchant ship carrying freight of some kind, and working on that job. Those are the people that they would try to press because they have the skills and the experience that you need in the Navy. So they would go to the ports and try to press some of the crew members of ships there. Now, there were rules on how many they could take. They couldn't strip away an entire crew from the ship that's owned by a merchant, a private businessman, because you'd put him out of business. I don't know the rules, but there were limits on how many men you could press off of one particular ship. But they would take people off these ships and put them from working as a civilian to working as a sailor in the Navy. Well, those crew members knew that, that they're really targets of the press gangs, so many of them would jump ship. They would desert, and they would leave their job as a crew member on a British ship. Now where would they go? They'd go onto an American ship. They would, they knew how to do that. That was what they had been doing for all their lives, however many years that might be, and that's what they knew. That's their occupation. They're sailors, so they would be a sailor as a crew member aboard an American merchant ship. Well, the English Navy would stop American merchant ships, and they would go aboard, and they said they were looking for British subjects who had been employed in the British merchant ships and have deserted. They're now working on an American ship. But hey, come on, nobody's got IDs, nobody's got any documents, nobody's got any records, anything. They don't have those things. And frankly, all the English Navy would do would be to go around and look around and see if they could find some guy who looked like, like he knew how to work on a boat, probably a relatively young guy, strong, healthy, in good physical shape. I mean, that's what you'd be looking for. And they'd take you, and they didn't care whether you were a British subject or a British immigrant into America or an American person born and raised entirely in the United States. They don't care. They're just taking people. And the British Navy had, over a couple of years, impressed something like 700 or 800 Americans, many of whom, as I said, are never seen from again. I mean, you go on an English Navy and they get into a battle, and that's the end of it. So we have been objecting all along with England about impressment, saying that this is a violation of basic human rights. So England is violating our neutral rights and our basic human rights, the rights of everybody to have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And the English Navy is invalidating that by their policy of impressment. And we've been negotiating about that and arguing about that with England forever. Every time we find out about a couple more Americans having been impressed, we have a meeting with a diplomat from the British service somewhere, either a diplomat to the United States or our diplomat to England, and we argue and complain and we say this is a violation of rights, and we get nowhere. We get absolutely nowhere. The English Navy knows that without impressment, they shut down. I mean, they're out of business because they absolutely relied on that to keep their manpower up. So, between our neutral rights and our human rights, President Madison argued to Congress, we need to go to war against England. We have been negotiating with them. We've tried to pressure them with Macon's Bill number 2. We've cut off our trade to them again, and it hasn't worked. So we just have to go to war. And Congress agreed. Congress voted in June to declare war against England. And we'll call this, because it's 1812, we'll call it, for want of a better name, the War of 1812. Well, far be it from me to criticize an American president and accuse him of lying, but to be honest, President Madison, maybe not as lying, and not in the sort of in the way that we understand lying by a president today, but he was less than candid, less than totally honest with Congress and with the American people in why we should go to war against England in 1812. And there were other issues that he mentioned in his address to Congress, but he kind of passed over them, and some of these sort of have to read between the lines to understand what he's talking about. The United States has another reason why we want to go to war against England in 1812. And it's going to be a surprise to you. What do we want in foreign policy? Oh, well, we want more land. We have always been after land. That's why we went to war with England in 1775, because they wouldn't let us use that land west of the Appalachians. And now we're going to war to get some more land. And you might say, wait a minute. What land do we want? We had just acquired Louisiana a couple of years earlier, 9 years earlier, and we've hardly started to settle it. I mean, there's almost nobody, no Americans living in that land yet. We've still got so much land we don't know what to do with it east of the Mississippi River, the land that we acquired in the Treaty of 1783 from England. Why do we want more land? And what land are we talking about? Well, during the debates in Congress, Congress has been talking about this for some time, debating about the embargoes and all of these other things. Some members of Congress had said we should try to get Florida. So we want Florida. But that's not held by England. That's held by Spain. So what's that? But America. So that's not really a reason to go to war against England, but it shows that we're still thinking about land. There's still land around that we don't have that we want. So we want Florida. And that's come up a couple of times. There have been members of Congress who've said, we should try to get Florida from Spain. That should be ours. Why? Because it should be. But much more frequent and much more discussed and brought up more often was that we wanted Canada. Now see, we haven't talked about Canada here in this class very much. I haven't had any occasion to do so. But, at the time of the Revolution, England had more colonies in America than the 13 colonies that became part of the United States. They had several colonies up in what is now Canada. One we've heard of was Quebec. That was the former French colony, and that was Quebec, and that had become an English colony, and we know about that. I mean, Quebec was the colony that got all that land in the West, according to the Quebec Act. And then there are some smaller colonies up there, the New Brunswick and so forth, that are long-time English colonies. And so there were actually something like 17 English colonies in North America, not just 13. But only 13 of them had declared their independence. But Americans thought, you know what, that's just sort of an historical oversight. Those other colonies should be part of us. We're all British subjects in North America. We're all oppressed by this horrible king. We're all victims of English imperialism. We should all become independent. And we thought, it's just a matter of time until Canada joins us, becomes a natural part of us. We're the natural thing. We should all be the former British colonies in North America. We should be one country. And that idea had not died. So people were still talking about that now here in 1811, 1812.